Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. Today, we're going to react to a YouTube channel called Side Projects. Side Projects is a YouTube personality who covers a wide range of human achievements throughout human history. I will leave a link to their channel and sister channel, Mega Projects, I'll get there eventually, below. So we are also going to start a couple of minutes in to bypass their sponsor. But before I actually start, if you guys do like this sort of content, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. And let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. So, without further ado, let's get started.
The Bible is the best-selling book of all time, with an estimated 5 billion copies ever being produced and sold. The importance that the Bible has had in shaping human history couldn't be overstated, but there are many different interpretations of the book. To some, the Bible is the work of God, with every word meant to be taken literally. To others, it's a combination of history and parables, figurative metaphors intended to teach some moral lesson rather than being treated as literal events. And of course, to many people, it's nothing more than a work of fiction. Despite controversy over the contents of the book, scholars generally agree that Jesus was a real historical figure. The consensus is that he was baptized by John the Baptist, debated Jewish authorities on the subject of God, and was crucified by Pontius Pilate, the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea. All other aspects of the life of the historical Jesus are much more contested. In addition to writings by Christians, Jesus, his followers, and his crucifixion are mentioned by several Roman historians as well, such as Pliny the Younger and Tacitus. However, though these historical references have brought about a general consensus on the existence of the historical Jesus, there isn't actually any direct evidence. No relic or artifact that is claimed to be tied to Jesus is proven to be authentic. But the Bible is a big book, and there's lots of...
And he's absolutely correct. What we do have is textual evidence of historical figures like Jesus through the literature of Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, as well as Roman emperors Julius Caesar and Tiberius. This textual evidence would also include the historical Jesus. However, we do not have any archaeological evidence that he existed. This isn't really a problem, though, because we have textual evidence of other historical figures without archaeological evidence, such as Cleopatra or the father of Alexander the Great, Philip II. I think it is also worth mentioning here that we have scant evidence of a majority of figures from the ancient world as well, and not just Cleopatra or Philip II.
Stuff going on in it, and much of the Old Testament is intended as a historical record of the origins of the Israelites. It's no surprise then that discoveries have been found that confirm parts of the book to be based in fact rather than in fiction.
And here we go.
Menopitar, the son of Ramesses the Great, was an Egyptian pharaoh for 10 years during the late 13th century BC. In 1896, an inscription was found in Thebes that became known as the Menopitar Stele. The stele was 28 lines long and chronicled Menopitar's victory over the ancient Libyans. However, the last 3 lines of the stele shift away from the Libyans into the region of Canaan. In this section, it is stated that Israel is laid waste. This inscription is the oldest non-biblical reference to Israel and the only reference from ancient Egypt. This was a massive discovery, as the Old Testament is largely viewed by historians as more of a national myth than an accurate historical chronicle by the Israelites. Thanks to the discovery of the Menopitar Stele, it is known that Israel was its own nation with its own culture, occupying a land in Canaan as far back as at least the 13th century BC.
And he's absolutely correct. The Menopitar Stele does list Israel as a people group, but it does not list this people group as a nation yet, because they were unlanded, as the hieroglyphs on the stele state. They were more than likely, if you hold to a late date Exodus, wandering through the wilderness when this stele was made. I also mentioned this in my video on Ramesses II, which I attempted to argue why he was the best candidate for the Exodus pharaoh. Moving on here.
Aside from Jesus, no character in the Bible has as much depth and character development as King David. David was essentially a nobody. His family was not wealthy or important, and he was the smallest of 8 brothers. Following a message from God, David was secretly named Israel's true king before going on to become its greatest king. David conquered Jerusalem, which was then made Israel's political and cultural center. He annexed the coastal lands, and he defeated the Philistines with such severity that they would never dare threaten the Israelites again. And for a long time, scholars believed that he was entirely fictitious. In 1993, an archaeological team was studying Tel Dan, a city from ancient Israel. In the research, they discovered remnants of a stone wall. The wall bore an inscription, though the entire inscription did not remain intact. It was written in Aramaic, and it details victories over 2 kings of Israel. The first name is partially cut off, but it almost certainly reads Jehoram, son of Ahab. The other king does not appear to be mentioned by name, only identified as the king of the house of David. The Tel Dan inscription is dated to the 9th century BC, and this simple message of battle corroborates many passages from the Bible. To start, the house of David would mean the lineage of King David. This was only written roughly 150 years after King David would have died, which seems like too short of a time for someone to fraudulently attempt to establish a noble family lineage to a king that never even existed. It's not definitive proof that King David existed, but it certainly is evidence that it's more likely true than not. The inscription also points to other passages from the Book of Kings being true as well. Though Aramaic was common amongst the Israelites, the government and the wealthier citizens predominantly wrote in Hebrew. Had this conflict come from within the nation of Israel, the inscription surely would have been in Hebrew. According to the Bible, Jehoram was killed by the Aramean king Hazael, whose language would have been Aramaic. The dates of Hazael's reign line up with the date of the Tel Dan inscription, so the biblical Book of Kings is likely more fact than fiction.
So like he said, the Tel Dan inscription was discovered in 1993, and it is true that it reads House of David, with little scholarly debate there. Unfortunately, though, the recovered fragments of the Tel Dan inscription do not preserve the names of the specific kings on Israel, the divided monarchy side, who were involved in this brutal encounter. But most scholars tend to believe the stele recounts a campaign of Hazael of Damascus, in which he defeated both Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah. So there really isn't much more going on with this inscription other than that. So we'll just leave it there and continue on, shall we?
King Solomon is portrayed as a wise, powerful, and wealthy king of Israel. Like David, he was one of the 48 Jewish prophets. Also like David, there was a healthy dispute over whether or not Solomon ever existed. Regardless of whether Solomon existed, both sides generally agreed that the lavishness of the Israelite empire during this time period is an exaggeration. It's also unlikely that the story of Solomon's judgment, in which he proposed cutting a baby in half to deduce who the real mother was, is...
Just a comment here. I would agree with him about the wealth that is described in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles is more than likely an exaggeration or a hyperbole. I would also like to note that this does not mean that the United Kingdom was not wealthy. They were at a crossroads for trade, no doubt, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, that the kings of Judah and Israel exploited for financial gain. But that's a side note, and he's actually going to talk about the gates here, so we'll just let him digress.
It's an historical event. There were many similar stories in folklore from that region, and while the account of Solomon is the oldest written example, others could have predated it in oral tradition. Archaeological excavations at the settlements of Azor, Gezer, and Megiddo have uncovered 6 chambered gates that allegedly date back to the 10th century BC, when biblical chronology states that Solomon would have been king. These gates would provide evidence of the impressive construction that the Bible claims took place under Solomon's reign. There is some disagreement on the dating of these gates, particularly at Gezer, with some scholars believing that they were built centuries later. There are no references to King Solomon in any historical texts outside of the Bible, something that could call his entire existence into question. However, this is not necessarily meaningful on its own. One of the things that made Solomon's reign so unusual was that it was a time of peace, with no wars or battles fought at all. Records from 3,000 years ago.
The guy built the temple, the first temple. So yeah, it was an extremely peaceful reign during Solomon's reign. So unlike David's reign or the following kings. So
Yes, to begin with, and if King Solomon wasn't leading an army into battle against anyone, there wouldn't have been much of note for those outside of Israel to write about. These three gates may not provide as strong evidence for the existence of Solomon as the Tel Dan inscription did for the existence of David, but if they are indeed from the 10th century BC, then they corroborate much of the Bible's text regarding the construction and renovation that took place under Solomon's reign, even if these projects weren't quite as extravagant as the Bible may make them out to be.
Just one more quick note before he moves on here to the Moabite Stone. As for the gates of Gezer, they are dated to the Iron Age. However, I think he touched upon this, but there is still some debate as of recent, circulating around this date, arguing for a later date, roughly around 8th century BC. And like he said, one of the major things for that is because it doesn't necessarily mention Solomon. So you have these gates that date to at least the Iron Age, probably Iron Age 2, A or B. So, since it doesn't really mention Solomon, we cannot really know definitively or say definitively that these gates date to the reign of Solomon. So, the Moabite Stone.
In 1868, the Merbite Stone was found at the ancient site of Dibon in what is modern-day Dibon in Jordan. A papier-mâché impression of the stone was made on behalf of an archaeologist based in Jerusalem. At the time, the area was being heavily scoured for any evidence that would prove the historical accuracy of the Bible. When word got out about the Merbite Stone, France, England, and Germany all set forth trying to acquire the valuable piece of history. The Bani Hamida tribe, who were in possession of the stone, didn't like the idea of these other nations coming in and laying claim to the artifact, so in an act of defiance, they smashed it into several pieces and sold it on the antiquities market. Many of these pieces have been recovered, though not all of them. So why is the Merbite Stone so important? The translation of the stone has been updated several times to become more accurate, but the general meaning remains the same. The 34 lines of text begin, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh Gad, king of Moab. The stone is most likely a victory stone, designed to explain who Mesha was and to outline his military victories. In the text, Mesha tells of his war against the Israelites and their king, Jehoram. This same war is outlined in the Bible's Book of Kings. The accounts aren't identical, but if anything, this highlights their authenticity as being depictions of the same conflict from opposing viewpoints. The Merbite Stone emphasizes Mesha's victories over Israel and the capturing of cities. On the other hand, the Bible places the emphasis on Israel's successful counterattacks against the Moabites. These two accounts don't contradict one another. They simply tell the opposing sides of the same story, with each side playing up their own victories and ignoring their own defeats. This provides further evidence that much of the Old Testament history of the Israelites may indeed be an accurate telling of events as told from their point of view, even if some details, particularly in regards to King Solomon, were exaggerated.
And again, he's absolutely right. The Moabite, or the Mesha stele, as it is sometimes called, does corroborate the biblical account, specifically 2 Kings 2:3. Now, the event itself happened around between 850 and 840 BCE, and it talks about Mesha's rebellion against kings Jehoram of the Omride dynasty and Jehoshaphat of Israel. The two kings, Although these kings of the divided monarchy did meet with some success, it appears that Mesha was actually able to gain independence. I also think what is fascinating at this stage of history, especially, is that prior to Mesha's rebellion, archaeology is rather scant about because of the late Bronze Age collapse. What I mean by that is there really aren't a lot of archaeological remains or discoveries dating from the late Bronze Age to about 850 BC. So we're relatively lacking, if you will, for that 200, 300 year period of the late Bronze Age collapse. So we just do not have a lot of textual or archaeological evidence of the time period. But what's interesting is that after 850 BC, things start to pick up. We start finding textual evidence, archaeological evidence of things in the ancient Near East. So, yeah.
Though there was thought to be some truth to it, the Book of Exodus has long been considered by scholars to be the founding myth of the Israelites, rather than a particular...
We actually call it an etiological account of the origins of Israel. Etiological just means an origin history or account. That's all it means.
Historical accounts. The book follows the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land of Canaan. We know from the Menopitar stele that the Israelites had established themselves...
I've got a Menopitar stele. I just like how he says it.
In Canaan by the 13th century. But how much of what happened before then could be historically accurate? Perhaps the most famous portion of the Book of Exodus is when Moses parts the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to walk across the water before it comes crashing back down to drown the Pharaoh's army. There is no non-biblical evidence that such an event ever occurred. Indeed, the story sounds like the sort of thing that would have to be taken entirely on faith. However, recent research has discovered that such an event is actually scientifically possible. There are two key elements of the story that are extremely important, one of which is often overlooked. In movies like The Ten Commandments, Moses is always depicted as raising his arms and causing the sea to immediately part by the will of God. However, this is
still one of my favorite films ever, The Ten Commandments, by Cecil B. DeMille, the 1956 version.
Isn't actually how it's described in the biblical text. The King James translation of Exodus 14:21 reads, "And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided." Across all translations, the important part of this passage does not change. The sea did not instantly part, but rather it was the result of a strong wind blowing for an entire night. The other key element of the story is the discrepancy in translations. While Moses is often cited as parting the Red Sea, the more accurate translation is believed to be the Sea of Reeds. This leads to some assumptions on behalf of researchers as to the exact topology of the area at the time and where the Sea of Reeds would have been, but they found a candidate. Just south of the Mediterranean Sea is Tanis, which it is believed would have met with the Nile Delta thousands of years ago when this event would have taken place. Lake Tanis was still an ideal place for wild reeds to grow, which lends some credence to the idea that this area could have been the Sea of Reeds. Whether this was the actual location of the story or not, the parting sea could have been the result of a wind setdown. This is a coastal phenomenon where extended periods of strong wind push the water back completely. It's not just a hypothetical scenario either, as it is something that has been seen fairly recently both at the Nile Delta and in Lake Erie. If the proposed location is correct, easterly winds exceeding 60 miles per hour for the entire night could have pushed back the water, creating a land bridge with water on either side. Computer models of exactly what this weather pattern would have done show that the Israelites would have had 4 or 5 hours to cross the land bridge of roughly 1.8 to 2.5 miles in length. Even with the terrain likely being muddy, that's an extremely reasonable pace. Once the wind stopped, the water would come crashing back and cover the newly created land bridge. Though this doesn't confirm the parting of the Sea of Reeds happening, it shows that it is absolutely possible that it could have happened, especially taking into account that the Bible specifically notes that it took an entire night for the water to recede rather than being nearly instantaneous. Even if this was a real historical event, the idea of the Pharaoh's chariots being in hot pursuit and then being drowned by the waters, while very technically possible, would likely be a bit of an embellishment.
All right. Yeah, definitely. I was going to correct him when I first watched this. When he says Red Sea, I was prepared to correct him and say it's the Sea of Reeds or Reed Sea. But I'm actually quite happy he said it should be translated as Reed Sea, and I absolutely concur with him. But yeah, within the past 30 years, or I should say the past 30 years, have yielded evidence, extra biblical evidence as well, of a possible exodus. So how he described the wind set down is also entirely possible if the exodus occurred somewhere near or at Tanis. Moreover, the wind set down does happen in that area of the Nile Delta as well, and we've actually seen it. We've actually seen the wind set down with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, as he says in the video here, and it actually pushed back the water, allowing for a land bridge. Absolutely. And as much as I absolutely love the topic of the Exodus, there's just too much to discuss on that topic, so I'll have to avoid that or go through it next time. But this is just one small piece of the Exodus in general, whether you believe in the late or the early date Exodus. Although I think the early date Exodus doesn't say that the flood occurred near Take Tanis, in just east of the Nile Delta. They actually opt for the Gulf of Aqaba, if I'm not mistaken. So there's that. Well, guys, that concludes this episode of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below on these discoveries. So I will see you next time.